And I just want to amplify what you said about the shift that you took in thinking about strategic approaches over the next 5 years and how accessible the Canadian legislative system, and I don't know if you feel the same way about the legal system. I was wondering if you could unpack that a little bit more. Why do you think the Canadian system is so open? Because that is definitely what I hear from a lot of artists, is that I'm not qualified to go in and talk to my MP. And a lot of, understandably, feel like there are a lot of barriers to doing advocacy work. So I was wondering if you could unpack that observation.
That's a really good question. So one of the best quotes I've ever heard is like, government doesn't create the bandwagon, they jump on the bandwagon. So that always really resonated with me because, yeah, I've been there. You feel like your voice doesn't matter. You feel really intimidated by the grandeur of someone's position, especially when it's a politician. But when you really look into it, what I found is that it's pretty laid out in black and white. What does the politicians need to be elected? When they get elected, they have specific mandate letters and commitments that they made during the election, or that come from the speech from the throne. And if we can look at what an election cycle is and what folks are supposed to do when they're in those positions representing us, well, I think most Canadians can do that. And that's all it takes to be able to walk in, meet with your MP, and understand how to frame your issue within a language that MPs will understand.
Yeah, definitely. I often say to colleagues who've never done a meeting or a Hill Day before that MPs are jack of all trades. We're the experts. You are the expert. You are bringing in an expert opinion, and they're lucky to have you in the room. And to like sort of flip that understanding of who has the power in the well, not necessarily power in the relationship, but how that exchange is going to happen. Let's move on to the Enchanté Network, because it's 3 years old. Is that right?
Yeah, I think we're 3 years old, baby.
3 years old.
Okay.
I am in awe of all you have accomplished in terms of a policy walk side of things, and how you have moved your recommendations down and through government and the allies and ambassadors that you have found within government. So I'd love you to tell us about how was the Enchanté Network formed?
Thank you for being so kind and sharing those words. Like, I know that this conversation is being recorded, so folks maybe you'll be listening to it and can't see, but I was smiling very, very wide when Kate was speaking. All right, so this is the story of the Enchanté Network. I think it goes back to the history of social movements. Social movements, they start usually with one very brave act from a group of people or a person who just couldn't take it anymore. Within queer and trans movements, we have Marsha P. Johnson throwing the first brick at Stonewall. And that was a huge moment where this Black trans woman just said, enough is enough. That's all it took to get people mobilized and to get people to realize that better is possible. We can imagine more, and we can determine and define a new norm, one that includes us too. Within that spirit, the Enchanté Network really came to be because there was a gap in the Canadian landscape. We have amazing organizations, but what does it mean for us to be connected across the world's second largest country? Pretty vast, pretty different in different provinces and territories. Everyone's doing amazing work. But where is that collective voice? A collective voice that isn't top down, but a collective voice that's bottom up, member driven. And that's where the idea for Enchanté came from. It was a lot of work by our brilliant board chair, Rachel Lowen-Walker, out in Saskatoon, who was the previous executive director of Out Saskatoon, and others. And when those early EDs met, some of them are still even on our board, but when they met in the US at Centerlink is basically a very similar concept to Enchanté. They're the uniting network for all LGBT centers in the United States of America. All these Canadian EDs would meet in random parts of the US, and they didn't know each other. So they would be getting coffee, being like, hey, what do you do? Where are you from? Oh, I'm from Canada. I'm the executive director of this queer organization. And then folks were like, oh, wait, I'm from Canada too. And they've never met before. So it just became this funny running joke that folks had to leave Canada to meet other EDs doing similar work in Canada. Some really visionary folks led by Rachel came back to Canada and said, you know what, we need a queer network in Canada. There's so much amazing work being done that there needs to be a platform for. And that was the genesis of the Enchanté Network. So 3 years later, we're the largest network of queer organizations in the country. Kate said it earlier, we represent more than 200 independent 2S LGBTQI plus organizations. We focus on capacity building and mostly on advocacy. And that growth, that huge upward trajectory of bringing people together speaks to one thing, and that's that this was a necessary organization. People were waiting for it, hungry for it. And it's always my honor to be the executive director, kind of leading this first chapter of Enchanté.
And when you say your focus is on advocacy, I just want to acknowledge how hard that is, because for what I'm imagining are 200 mid-sized, probably a lot of small, probably just a handful of large organizations, to get them to acknowledge that, because there probably aren't a lot of directors of government relations, if any, that or public affairs or advocacy or public policy for that matter, to get them to say, yes, we need to focus on federal advocacy is a huge step in the first place. That is really, really important. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the 200 organizations. Are they spread evenly across the country? And how do you, no, I don't want to ask about where they are. I want to ask, like, how do you connect with them? Is it one-on-one conversations? Do you have like the BC caucus meeting? How do you build this network? What are the nuts and bolts of actually talking to these 200 amazing organizations?
All right, so how do we connect with each other? So first, I'll start by saying that, there's a very particular audacity of queer and trans people. I feel like we are extremely audacious. Like, we'll just say what's on everyone's mind, because at the end of the day, when society is trying so hard to push you out, to silence you, to say that you don't belong here, you just generate this spirit of you can either go one way or the other. You can agree with being silent, or you can understand that you have to be the loudest person in the room to be heard even just a little bit. So that's the spirit of our national policy framework and approach to it, audacity. How do we connect? I'll start with our most informal way of connection. So Enchanté, we host shared connections and capacity building events every single month. There's a minimum of 4 different times where we have 2 events just connecting folks in our membership to talk about the issues that are important to them. And then 2 events that focus on building capacity in those organizations. To give some concrete examples, one of the things that we connect organizations is identity. So if you're a Black leader in Canada, you're probably few and far between in our network. So creating that space where Black leaders can come together and talk about the hardships and realities of leadership, but also what that means with that racial dynamic with it as well. We unite our rural members. So if you are a huge center in a huge LGBT organization in an urban center, that's one reality. But what about all the different rural centers that are often the only lifeline for queer and trans people in their communities? We try to dismantle and debunk isolation and overcome it. So that's our programming, and from there, we really hear from people their audacious views on what the world should look like. And again, we play that translating role of talking about it and making it a reality on a national stage. But I think your question's more so about, what does our national policy framework look like? Mm-hmm. So right now, we have 2 spheres of influence. That is the federal government, so on a national stage, and also provincially. So the way it works at Enchanté is there are different provincial and territorial caucuses, and that the representatives, there's one representative organization in every province and territory, and that they work with those in their province and territory. So say Alberta, the National Alberta Representative Organization is voted by all members in Alberta, and their job is to have a pulse on the provincial realities in Alberta, whether it is a campaign to get queer issues on the political agenda or part of the political conversation during an election, or whether it's about to call out rollbacks on fundamental human rights that happen sometimes in this country. Mm-hmm. That's the provincial responsibility of the representative in that province, and the Enchanté Network is the backbone for that work. So more on the, how are we connecting this? What is the research? How should this look? Who's hosting the website? All the pieces that can sort of make an idea a bit hard to come to life. Enchanté is there to be the backbone for these movements provincially and territorially. Now we'll talk nationally. Nationally, each representative from each province and territory sits on our National Policy Advisory Committee. So that is a base to have conversations where folks are able to say, this is what's happening in Saskatchewan. This is what's happening in Newfoundland. This is what's happening in Ontario. These are our big successes. These are the strategies that are working. And we want to make sure that pushing for these issues nationally are the issues that will positively impact everyone across the country. And that's the goal, to bring all those different viewpoints, geographically and otherwise, together to distill it into common points that we push on a national stage for the benefit of everybody. And that's how it works at Enchanté.
Wow. Okay. So I used to be the executive director of a national arts service organization, and it was about 10, 15 years old when I was in the executive director position. And we can talk about burnout of that position as well too. But we had a really hard time in ensuring that there were representatives from each of those kinds of categories that you described. It sounds like you don't have that problem. Do you feel like you have those audacious representatives from all the subsectors within the 2S LGBTQIA community?
No, not even close. We have the same problem.
Okay, good.
There's a lot that goes into it, right? Bringing people together for a common goal sounds so nice, but it's one of the hardest things to do. Have you ever tried to plan a cottage trip with more than 10 friends?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So public policy coalition building is very much the same. A lot of different competing priorities, and like it really requires like expert facilitation in those spaces. One thing that I think makes it works to our advantage, but it's kind of a sad thing, is that the 2S LGBTQI plus sector in Canada is so underfunded. The advocacy work that we're doing is not a nice to have, but like an imperative for the survival of many of our member organizations. Since the founding of Enchanté, our advocacy has been able to generate more than $115 million in federal funding towards queer and trans organizations. That's money that keeps the door open for people to access gender affirming care, for queer and trans kids who get kicked out of their houses to have somewhere to go to, for trans folks that are experiencing hate crimes in their day-to-day life to be able to know where to turn, not only to report a crime, but to get support after that crime. That kind of, I don't want to say urgency, because I don't think that's a very good thing to have fuel advocacy, but it is something that fuels participation in advocacy. We know that the advocacy work that we're doing at the Enchanté Network through our coalition building wasn't being done before this organization in a way that brings together as many voices as we're bringing together. And that's kind of what gets us going to keep pushing on it, and kind of allows us to, we don't have to explain that to people that we're working with. We know that there is a direct line between the meetings that we're having and queer and trans organizations being able to keep their doors open.
Amazing. So that's heavy lifting, to say the least. I wanted to ask you, we were at a conference together in September in Montreal that Imagine Canada organized. And Tyler, you made the most important statement I felt in that conference. We were talking about a national policy network within the charitable sector, and people were focusing on transactions and budgets and what can we ask for. And you stood up and you said, before we can do any of that, we need to have trust. We need to build trust in our relationships. So I wanted to ask that question to you. How, in 3 years, have you built trust in the Enchanté Network?
Yeah, that's a really good question. When you're like, I remember you said something, I'm like, Kate, I say a lot of things. What did I say? That sounds like one of the better things that I've said. It's an ongoing process. Like, Enchanté was built through, it didn't just pop up. I think that was one of the great pieces of foresight from our board chair when she was like driving this organization from idea to reality. Enchanté had two separate national convenings where, through this government relations work, through generating support for our cause, we were able to get federal support to host those convenings and make sure that the people who needed to be there, who couldn't necessarily afford to be there, could be in the room. Everything from the name of the Enchanté Network to the positions in the network to the review of our bylaws, that all happened by bringing together folks who are already doing the work, bringing together queer and trans organizations across the country to have that first ever convening in Saskatoon where everyone was in person. And they said, okay, is this an idea, a national network for us? Like, is this something that could be useful for us? And if so, what do you want it to look like? And there was this sense of ownership from the members. Like, we weren't member driven the moment that we wrote it on our website. We were member driven from the moment the name was chosen for the organization. The second convening was, again, just another moment for people to reflect on, okay, so now we know we want to have this network, let's flesh it out even more. So again, that buy-in, and that's the first challenge. And I think that we passed it, building buy-in around the organization and not just throwing something into an ecosystem, but bringing the ecosystem along for the ride from the beginning. The second piece around building trust is around results. Okay, so now you're here, you have this buy-in. Well, there are a hell of a lot of expectations on what you are going to do as a national network. And that's why we focus not on the headline on CBC News or the headline du jour, but we focus on the future. My job every day is really to avoid thinking about the next 5 minutes and to always think about the next 5 years. So what does the future of the sector look like? And those results is what brings trust into the organization. Whether it was our 110,000 microgrant program that we secured at the very beginning, whether it's our capacity building programs that are able to be the net that catch organizations when they fall, despite the headlines that talk about the amounts of money they're getting, we're there to make sure that that money is supported by strong organizational infrastructure. And no one else is doing that work. And making sure now that folks are brought along for our policy and our advocacy agenda. That's how you build trust. Staying true to our member-driven kind of genesis and making sure that folks know what we're here for and that we deliver every single time, which is a lot of pressure, but it's good, you know, like we should have pressure on us. We should be like held accountable by our membership, and they should feel comfortable to do so. We don't want to re-perpetuate the same power dynamics that make people feel silent, because we all know what that feels like. Give us a little bit of like a tough time and hold us accountable, keep our feet to the fire, and we'll continue to deliver. And if we don't, we'll ask you how we can in the future.
I also want to highlight what you said about buy-in, because I think it is easy in the charitable sector to default to the scarcity mentality of like, we are all in competition with each other. And so therefore, we don't have buy-in because you're taking money away from me, or your organization has a similar message to mine. I just think that buy-in, having that accountability and working on those results right in the beginning, like the fact that you have already raised $115 million federally is so important to driving. And I don't want to say that it's all about money, but it's definitely driving the network to see it's worth these meetings. It's worth this investment of time to keep the thing going.
That it's worth our time, like it's going somewhere. Because every moment someone's in a meeting with us talking about Ottawa politics on Parliament Hill, it's a moment that they could be spent like connecting with the direct service clients, you know, that are walking through and around like their Zoom calls as they're meeting with us. So yeah, I think you put it perfectly, like the worth of you know, the time that they're spending with us. It's important.
And that can be so hard when it comes to government relations and advocacy, because government moves at a glacial pace at times. Sometimes, don't get me wrong, there's a pandemic and they can move really quickly. But yeah, government moves slowly, and it's hard to justify that time sometimes.
Coming up with the ask is a little bit less about quantifying and mathematics and a little bit more about understanding a person. If we take a little bit more of like a human approach, if government was a person, what is this person typically like funding? What is this government typically interested in funding? What are the levels of funding they've given out for similar projects? What's something that needs a certain level of approval? So under a certain amount, you can get approval from bureaucrats. Over a certain amount, you need approval from the political authority. What are the resources that we have available to us as a network in terms of what it takes to affect change at each of those different levels. And sometimes, yeah, it's the path of least resistance. And other times, like our upcoming advocacy policy priority that I hope I get to talk about today, it's about really putting a lot of resources and taking a big chance for something that could potentially have a big payout for the sector. Coming up with the 25 million, it was at a time by looking at mandate letters, looking at what was funded in the past, and understanding that we needed to have that win in a very short period of time. So what is the easiest way to do that? Is it asking from different departments, or is it making a big federal ask and then providing a pathway for them to do that in the shortest amount of time possible? And I think that is super connected to your second question, which is how do you measure success? So the first way that we measure success is based on our members. If you are not a network organization, maybe sometimes those nonprofits will measure success by how much money they brought into their organization. You'll always hear executive directors talking about how they increase the funding or diversify the funding streams for their organization by however million%. At Enchanté, we sort of measure the success of our campaigns by how stable is the sector today at the end of this campaign versus how stable was the sector at the beginning of our campaign. So if there's an additional 25 million in community capacity funding, but it only goes to 4 different organizations, we didn't do a very good job. If there's 25 million and it went to 15 organizations, we did a better job. Those kind of metrics. And then the amount of money that we're able to generate for the sector is always super important. That goes without saying. 25 million is not enough. And when I talk about our next policy priority, I think folks will understand sort of where we're going and that next 5 years mindset and what that looks like.
Like thinking about what you said earlier, Tyler, that the sector is so underfunded that it is a matter of survival. So I love your metrics. I hesitate to use the word metrics because it isn't really about metrics. It's about the health of your network, really. I am dying to hear about your next advocacy campaign. So please tell us now.
The theme I keep bringing into this conversation is, like the next 5 years, not the next 5 minutes, right? So essentially, what do we, I could ask it to everyone here. I'm sure that there are folks on this call that understand it even better than me, but in the next 5 years, what is our federal political landscape going to look like? We're currently in a minority situation with a government that's very friendly to these issues, to queer and trans human rights and inclusion in Canada. We have the NDP Liberal Coalition. That's another big point. So what do we think it will look like? And, if we follow the history of Canadian politics, it's a pendulum that swings from one side to the other. Folks, pundits are saying that there might be a swing in a different direction. What does that mean for Enchanté's advocacy? Well, right now, I think nonprofits and arts and cultural organizations understand this. The boom and bust cycle of project funding. Here is money to do a project. The project is amazing. Now we want something new because the project's funding finished. Here is a government who cares about the arts, and then a government comes in and says, we don't care about the arts enough. And it's really this volatile, dizzying funding cycle, and we're caught in this loop. So at the Enchanté Network, what we're advocating for is, again, our key metric of success: stability. Right now, we're advocating a national endowment for queer and trans organizations. What an endowment looks like is that many different partners, both public and private partners, come together. They invest an initial big lump sum of money, and then that money is ethically invested, and the profits from that money then is able to be rolled out to communities in perpetuity. Think about it like an engine for a movement, a financial engine for a movement. And when we look at feminist movements, the Equality Fund has set up a wonderful endowment that no matter a change in government, the Equality Fund has an endowment that will continue to fund the movement forever. Brilliant minds after the murder of George Floyd and huge public conversations about anti-Black racism advocated strongly for the setting up of a Black-led philanthropic fund. That is another endowment. The government just pledged $200 million towards this endowment, and at current interest rates, that would yield a yearly return of $25,000 to $30,000 a year. So that's a good amount of money, and that will only grow And it's something that will continue despite maybe another government coming in and not thinking anti-Black racism or the murder of innocent Black folks is something that deserves the level of investment it's received from this current government. What does it mean for US LGBTQI plus organizations to also have an engine to continue to fuel this movement with the resources it needs to provide life-saving services? And that's the goal of the Enchanté Network with our next 5-year level thinking. It's, yes, we're asking for more project money, and we got that $100 million investment from the 2S LGBTQI plus federal action plan that was just announced, but that action plan has an end date. And it's our goal to make sure the money in that plan doesn't have an end date.
The Equality Fund obviously is your blueprint for an endowment. I wanted to see if you knew about Factor, which is a music fund that I only know a tiny little bit about it, but I know that it has that same kind of idea that, and this might be more attractive for if we had a conservative government, that corporations as well as the feds give into the endowment, and then the endowment in perpetuity is supporting the music industry. It's another example.
Amazing.
Yeah, those the three Ps, private-public partnership. Wow, that is a very, very exciting advocacy campaign, and exactly. We've been spending a lot of time at Imagine Canada thinking about the Liberal NDP agreement right now, and what the NDP could potentially put in the window this year. Is it going to be healthcare? Is it going to be something else as they move forward in this agreement that will probably last this year? Who knows, if you believe the pundits. How do we build relationships with the Conservatives and find our champions in the Conservative Party so that if the pendulum swings as we all expect it to do we already have those relationships with Conservative people, with Conservative MPs who could sit around a potential cabinet table in 2025 and understand and appreciate why our sector needs support. That is really important with the 5-year thinking. What I love about the Enchanté Network, Tyler, is how purposeful you are in trusting your members and collecting their perspectives before you take action. And that you're not feeling, at least from the outside, maybe you could explain to me if this is happening internally. From the outside, it doesn't look like you're pressured by government to move quickly and do that urgency thing. It seems that you're very intentional about, no, we have to hear from the members, we have to hear from this group, we have to hear from this group before we can give you this priority moving forward. Like, do you ever feel that push of urgency from government when they call you up at 4:00 on a Friday and say, I need to know X, Y, and Z?
Yes, let's be specific about the political side of government. Bureaucrats, I think they really understand it. They are slow, methodological. Political side of government moves super, super quick. To be very honest, we're not going to get it right every time. Sometimes you just have to move quick. There was an opportunity last year to really influence the role of human rights for intersex folks in Canada. And that was something that we needed to move very quickly on. So we were able to, luckily, we'd already done this work of convening intersex members within our membership and understanding what are the priorities that in terms of legislative change that can really honor the human rights of intersex folks in Canada. So we had that ready to go, but it was just sitting on a shelf waiting for an opportunity, and that opportunity came and needed to be executed within a week and a half. So sometimes you need to move very, very quickly and bring folks on board and back to that trust piece. If it was a first conversation, maybe organizations wouldn't have trusted us. But because we had already built those relationships through our monthly programming, through me being super accessible to our membership, there's that level of trust for folks to understand that sometimes we need to move really quick. And other times we have a bit more of a longer runway to get something done. So like I said, we're not going to get it right all the time, but I do know that if our members believe in us to get it right most of the time, that's one less barrier to go up against. And there's this amazing public policy wonk that I follow named Amanda Sussman. I recommend people to just follow her. She was the previous political advisor to 2 different cabinet ministers, including a minister of foreign affairs, and super brilliant But one of the things that she talks about is really about developing coherent messaging internally, and that idea of trust. I think it she doesn't use those words, but it always makes me think that that's what she's getting at. Being able to talk internally with your organizations, create that cohesive language that people feel comfortable with, and that happens when there's trust, that people felt heard in those conversations. If people feel heard at the beginning, they tend to give you a little bit more flexibility to weather the storm as different unknown variables come into play.
And to circle back to trust, I'm sure that they trust you to have their best interest at heart.
Absolutely. Absolutely. With the end goal being stability. And I think that, beyond each organization's individual, needs and agendas, I think everybody in the sector wants the sector to be stable and understands that if the sector is stable, it's just such a momentous opportunity right now where Canadians are finally tuning into these issues in a way that they never have before, and that the government is hearing it. So like I said, government doesn't create the bandwagon, they jump on it. And right now they're jumping on a bandwagon that came from Canadians saying queer and trans people deserve equal rights as everyone else.
So I was co-chair of the Canadian Arts Coalition, which the joke was we were an ad hoc volunteer group held together by a broken fax machine and a stapler. And we didn't have any funding. We sort of cobbled together funding to do Hill Days. What came first for the Enchanté Network? Did you have funding before you created the network, or did you create the network and then got the funding?
So we created the network, optimistically looked for funding, and then the funding came through. Nice. So that's the story. We had funding for 2 years when we first started Enchanté Network. But whether we had the funding or not, the wheels were already moving. So we weren't dissuaded by the what if it doesn't happen, or what if we don't get funding. We just kept building momentum until not giving us funding wasn't even an option. People saw the promise.
Absolutely. I highly encourage you to check it out and look at all the amazing advocacy that they're doing, the resources. And as I said in the introduction, I just think that there are a lot of parallels and certainly connections between the arts sector and the work that the Enchanté Network does. And I'm just so grateful that you could be with us today, Tyler. Thank you so much for joining us on the Why Bother webinar.
Yeah, a big thank you to Mass Culture, and thank you to you, Kate. It's great to learn from you, and also, thank you for bringing me into the conversation.